So it's left to men like Davis Younts to fight for these Navy
As
SEALs.
you know, I represent Navy SEALs, fighter pilots, Coast Guard rescue swimmers.
Pennsylvania attorney R. Davis Younts successfully defended an evangelical Navy lieutenant.
Lawyer R. Davis Younts says by doing this, the military may have violated the constitutional rights of U.S. troops.
You are an attorney who has successfully defended naval officer. Lieutenant.
Welcome to Making Sense of the Madness. Today we're going to be talking about the trials and tribulations of Donald Trump with Davis Younts. And we've got Michael Hitchborn to discuss the return of the COVID-19 84 nightmare and how to fight back. Buckle up and get ready to make sense of the madness. Now, it's with great dismay that I have emphasized time and time again over the last several years that if Donald Trump tried to run for president again, they would indeed try to incarcerate him and possibly succeed. And I'm preparing myself for the first time in history for a former president to go to jail, in my opinion, for not committing enough war crimes and daring to question and name the military-industrial complex and the media muppets that go along with them. And now we have more emphasis on them trying to rig the game. We now have an attempt to put a gag order and silence Trump on his January 6th fiasco, where we've already seen an extravagant show trial with a Hollywood producer at the helm with no end date and no real opposition, with a narrative that an insurrection took place, giving people who were waved into the Capitol, committed no violence, 15 years and more. In the case of Tario, we now have 22 years for not even being there. And that's not all. We have people calling for the idea that the Supreme Court will need to rule on whether or not Trump will be fit to run for the presidency. In fact, if they get him on this espionage charge, this insurrection charge, which is completely and totally fabricated. Roll that in with several other indictments, and we've got a lot to talk about with our next guest, Davis Younts. Davis, thank you so much for joining us. What are your thoughts on these latest developments, especially with the gag order?
Yeah, I think that the gag order is particularly troubling in that case because we're talking about a case where there has been no counter narrative to what's been put out on mainstream media as to what happened. So unfortunately, that creates a grave concern. And we have to look at this in context. First of all, we should already be concerned on whether or not somebody like President Donald Trump can get a fair jury in the DC circuit that he's in. Will he even be able to get a fair jury? Will he be able to get a fair hearing in front of the judge that's handling this case? And then when you layer onto that a gag order, you already have a tainted jury pool, right? So as an attorney, I try a lot of cases, and we do pay attention to the rules of professional ethics when it comes to, potentially tainting a jury pool. And the problem is the jury pool is already tainted, and now Trump and his defense team do not have an ability to counteract the false narrative that's already out there. So it's deeply troubling.
Absolutely. And I think this is just the beginning. We've already seen Giuliani found guilty without really a trial. We've seen them put Navarro in jail for something that was clearly the executive privilege of the president talking to an advisor. I don't know that this ends well. I mean, we can get into the Georgia case, but let's specifically talk about the DC case, because the DC case seems the most troubling, as you said, and could weigh in on whether or not he could indeed run. In fact, the media is already kind of parroting this narrative that he will be found guilty as an insurrectionist, and therefore the Supreme Court needs to rule whether or not he's eligible.
Right. That's absolutely right. So of all the cases that are out there, this is the one that comes the closest to invoking what's called Clause 3 of the 14th Amendment. That was passed after the Civil War, and it was, part of what was called the Insurrection Acts. The whole idea was someone who was holding office and who participated in a rebellion or a violent insurrection against the country as an office holder could not then be eligible to run. So that's the idea. So when you look at states, Colorado, California, the state of Washington, they're already coming forward. They're already trying to bring litigation to say, Trump participated in an insurrection, therefore he is not eligible to run. If he is convicted in this DC court, while insurrection is not in the indictment, those words aren't in the indictment, I think it would be a definite tool that they would try to use to say, hey, this proves he was involved with interfering with, the democratic process and therefore participated in an attempt to overthrow the government in some way.
Now, you talked about DC as a venue. It must be alarming to you that now we have all of these different rulings on the Proud Boys. And no matter what you think about that organization, it is clear that they did not commit the crimes in which they were charged and that it was a farce that they got a fair trial in that venue. I continue to say their best hope is for appeal, but appeal at a change of venue outside of the state. And as you know, that could take years at this point. Many of them already spending years in prison, sometimes in solitary confinement for things that you would normally get a ticket for and be let on your way. So when you do have that stacked against Trump, when you know the machine is after him, what do you think the likelihood is, not only in this case, but overall, that they actually put him in prison? And what does the country look like after that? Because when I talked to Roger Stone about this many months ago, probably about 8-9 months ago, he said, well, if he's convicted, he can still run from jail. There's nothing saying that a felon can't be on the ticket. But we don't live in normal times, Davis.
No, we absolutely don't live in normal times. And part of the problem that we have to just recognize as we move forward as a nation is that sometimes the process is the punishment. What do I mean by that? People say, well, went to trial and I was innocent, but I was acquitted. Great. The problem is, what did the legal fees cost you? What did it do to your life? How did it destroy your reputation? And what is the process? So right now, we are seeing the lives of many, many people being destroyed over what happened on January 6th. And again, there's a whole lot of unanswered questions about what actually happened. And we have to ask the question, why are 80-year-old women being put in federal prison over walking around inside the Capitol for 10 minutes when they walked through open doors and there were security guards moving gates for them? Again, we can talk a lot about who did right and wrong on that day, but we have to understand where prosecutorial discretion comes in and that the process is the punishment. Just look at what's happening to the people in the Georgia case in particular, and not to go off on that, but understand that the individuals involved in that, Trump and his co-defendants, are looking at between $500,000 and $1 million of legal fees. And some of the people that were charged in that case are attorneys who were representing President Trump as he was trying to go through the legal process of challenging an election. So now, not only are we taking people who would not be punished unless the federal government was involved, or if it was handled at state or local level, we're looking at nuisance, disorderly conduct, trespassing fines, right? Low-level misdemeanor or summary offenses. Now we're turning these into federal crimes. We're turning these into conspiracies. And worse, we're going after the attorneys. And so now you're creating a situation where not only we're using process as punishment, but we're also discouraging attorneys from stepping forward and representing these individuals, because who's to say that a rogue, Soros-funded elected prosecutor isn't going to then go after and persecute attorneys that represent individuals in these cases, whether it's DC, New York, or Georgia?
Well, who's to say? They're doing it. I mean, it's right in your face, and we will absolutely get to that. But I want to make the point that Trump may not even be able to make his case. You talked about what happened on January 6th. I'm seeing headlines again that Trump is making the claim that he said he wanted 10,000 soldiers at the scene. That's not a claim. We've known this from the very beginning, that he requested 10,000 National Guard on the scene. The evidence is in the public arena that Nancy Pelosi denied that request. We've had several eyewitnesses at the highest levels of law enforcement discuss those discussions that took place. Yet there's a very real, not possibility in my opinion, but probability that that evidence won't even be allowed to be presented in his case. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I share that concern. And again, we have to look at the judge. This is an Obama appointed judge in the DC case. She has strong family ties to the Communist Party of the Bahamas. Her father and grandfather were communists. And so we know there's a political agenda there. We know where loyalties lie as far as that goes. So this judge is someone who should come under extreme scrutiny when we look at the pretrial rulings. And again, as an attorney, I deal with this all the time. A judge can really shape a case fairly or unfairly by what evidence is allowed to come in and be presented to a jury. And again, Trump has an uphill battle. If it's going to be extremely unlikely that anyone that voted for him or would even consider voting for him is going to end up on a DC jury. So that's a huge problem he faces as well.
Wrapping up on the DC case, let's talk about the timeline that we're seeing in this case. I'm not seeing, obviously, Trump's attorneys have presented evidence that they say is stacked higher than the Washington Monument. And I honestly do believe that. They're not going to give them more time. Obviously, this case is going to be fast tracked. So, in your opinion, when do you think the trial will begin? And when do you think we'll have a verdict? Because my prediction is we'll probably see a verdict right around primary season if these people get their way, to kind of ensure at least just an initial and then less controversy of not allowing him to be on that ticket.
Well, the judge is pushing to schedule the case to start the day before Super Tuesday during primary season. So we talk about scheduling during primary season. Absolutely. The judge is trying to schedule the case to have it start the Monday before the Super Tuesday primary. So absolutely, that's a huge issue. And what's troubling is in ruling on defense requests to have the case scheduled in 2025 in order to give them time to prepare and put it past the primary season, past election season, the judge said, well, personal things shouldn't interfere with going to trial. That's absurd. Those things happen all the time. Cases get delayed all the time for appropriate reasons, particularly where the defense team or the defendant says, if we go to trial, then I will not have time to adequately prepare, which is what they have said. And any judge would be perfectly within reason, within law, with principles of fairness and justice to say, look, yeah, the primary season is a big deal, and we don't want the primary season to interfere with a fair trial. So we will take that into consideration. We will take those dates into consideration. And so far, this judge has not done that. So that is absolutely one of the concerns I think we have to pay very careful attention to.
Now, before we go to break, do you also think that the possibility of another one of these indictments taking place within that same time period, maybe doubling up?
Absolutely. The judge is already looking to do that. That's what the prosecution is pushing for as far as scheduling goes. Initially, one of the dates for these cases was the day before the Iowa caucus, right? So they're already pushing hard to make these dates very, very difficult, and then pretending as if primary season or other things that are happening should have nothing to do with this. But if the goal isn't to ensure he has a fair, full trial, then we should be skeptical of the scheduling. Absolutely.
We got to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk Georgia and beyond. You can find everything you need to know about Davis Younts over at yountslaw.com. We'll be back after this. It's Making Sense of the Madness.
The world is about to shift. Banks are going cashless globally with the emergence of central bank digital currency, which will bring with it programmable money and the ability to turn on or off your purchasing power based on your digital social profile. It's like the equivalent of spyware in your bank account. You need to get out of the system with the world's safest and most private assets, silver and gold. Call Kirk Elliott, PhD, 720-605-3900.
What should people know about that whole blow up with Project Veritas?
I read a few people wrong, and that's my fault, but I learned from that, and I think I'll be a more effective messenger as a result of that. That'll free me up to do the next chapter, the next stage of my evolution, which is OMG, which is decentralizing journalism, and sometimes things happen for a reason. That's my goal, that's my mission, and I didn't ask for that mission. I never thought that would be my mission. It just has become my mission, and I'm excited about it.
We are back, and the media has already framed this up as Trump is a danger. Trump is the next Hitler if he wasn't the first Hitler. I mean, they've really taken it that far. They've talked about white supremacy being his base and the worst domestic terrorist threat. You have Joe Biden in his dementia-ridden state talking about quote-unquote MAGA Republicans. And of course, the Huffington Post is already framing it as much of the media. They're saying, hey, he's an insurrectionist. He's going to be found guilty. We need the Supreme Court to weigh in right now and not allow his coup attempt. There was no coup attempt, folks. He was in an effort not to overturn an election, but to audit one fairly that reeked of corruption on a level that we have never seen. Meanwhile, I am seeing some celebrations within the conservative media, and I'm not exactly sure why. Perhaps Davis can give us some insight that a couple of these cases in Georgia have been ruled on to be held separately. Now, as I understand this, you not only have these indictments that are forward, but you have 30 other indictments. You have a RICO case. And in my opinion, I think you're going to have an effort to try to find more crimes by cutting deals with people who are in these cases. So first of all, what do you think on the ruling? And secondly, what do you think of these other 30 people and the possibility of more crimes coming out of this RICO case?
Right. So the first thing we have to do is just look at RICO cases, right? These are designed to lump people into some sort of a formal organization. And the goal, they were started with the idea of taking down the mob, right? So you get the driver, you get the bag man, and then you turn them, and then you call everything that happened a conspiracy, so then you can get the mob bosses. That's what they're trying to turn this into in Georgia. They're using this racketeering statute to do that. So absolutely what they will do is bring as many individual defendants into the case as possible, and then they'll try to attribute anything any individual did to someone else, right? So, for example, they will try to say, well, this individual, didn't have authorization to take custody of voter data or voting data from a hard drive, and they'll say, well, that they didn't have authorization, that was illegal, so everyone's responsible for that one decision made by one or two people involved in the case. So that's the framing that they're trying to do. We have to understand it from that point, and then we can look at other things that are happening. We'll say, okay, two defendants, so Sidney Powell, an attorney, and then another co-defendant in the case are scheduling their trial for October because they demanded a speedy trial, and the judge has allowed them to be split off. That's interesting. I would be more concerned about people cutting a deal if the DA had not opposed it, but the DA actually opposed it. So far in the Georgia case, there isn't a strong indication that anyone has cut a deal, unlike some of the other cases. If you look at the Mar-a-Lago, the classified documents case, there's every indication a couple of the co-defendants in that case are cutting deals, and that's why you see obstruction charges. But the thing to monitor in Georgia, from my perspective, is have they cut a deal with anyone, and what individual acts are they trying to say were illegal, and then they can try to turn that conspiracy. But even if they try to do that, what's critical, we have to take a step back. You don't hear this on most media outlets, is what is the object of the conspiracy? The object of the conspiracy has to be something unlawful. In other words, the DA in the Georgia case has to prove that their intent was to unlawfully interfere with an election. If the defense can prove that they had a good faith basis to believe the election was stolen, that there was things going on that were improper with regard to the election, then they've demonstrated they didn't have criminal intent. And that's what's so interesting about bringing attorneys into the case. They may have bitten off more than they can swallow. This does give Trump's defense team and the other defense teams to say, here's why we believe there were irregularities in Georgia. Here were our legitimate concerns. Here is that evidence. And our intent was to use all the legal processes that were available to us within the law to contest this election. So it's going to be very, very interesting. It's going to be a huge question of timing and whether or not they are allowed to present a full and fair case.
Well, I don't think they're going to be able to present that full and fair case. And that's my biggest fear of this whole thing. I mean, when this first started initially, I looked at the New York case. Obviously, that is the thinnest of all cases, was basically hyped up for years, even before the 2020 election. So, there wasn't much there, and there really isn't a lot of, criminal repercussions if he was to be found guilty on that case. So you're not that worried about it. But then, other indictments are coming. And I thought that the Georgia case wouldn't have teeth either, but with that RICO case against everybody and other defendants, like you said, cutting deals, it's really a wild card, in my opinion. You discussed the Florida case, and we haven't discussed that yet. In my opinion, the Florida case, obviously, the president had the right to take those documents. He took them with the help of government entities to a secure location, just like any other president has done in the past. However, they put up roadblocks to try to set him up. They then did set him up and acted as though he wasn't supposed to have those documents. At the same time, we get this story about Joe Biden as a vice president who would not have the right to declassify and take documents with him, to have documents in a much less secure location, and that's on the back burner. We fast-tracked this case. My fear is they set a precedent with this case, with the Espionage Act, in order to say if they do find Trump guilty, later on, they can get Biden to step down and say, well, we didn't want to do this twice, and the country's gone through so much, and he wasn't as defiant as Trump, so we'll just let him off, and he can go, and we won't try it, but he's got to step down as the presidency. Is that a likely scenario? And right now, with the deals that you think have been cut in the Florida case, how dangerous is that case for Trump?
It has become more dangerous because of the deals that they've cut. So again, framing this appropriately, you're right. This is about the Espionage Act. It's unprecedented to go after a sitting, a former president of the United States or a former, government official under the Espionage Act for just simply mishandling classified documents. We don't do that. That Espionage Act was created during World War I, during the Woodrow Wilson administration, to go after threats to the United States and sharing of secrets with foreign countries. That's not what's going on here. Normally, presidential documents are covered by the Presidential Records Act, which is a newer statute that has no criminal provisions. It just says, hey, we need to preserve these things because of their historical significance for purposes of the National Archives. I could see a scenario in the Florida case where a judge throws out the charges and says, the Espionage Act was never intended to cover this. However, if there's obstruction or false statement charges, those are always sort of a back-end way for a prosecutor to catch someone. We've seen that over and over and over again by, federal prosecutors that are aggressive, that are going outside the bounds of normal. They get you caught up in a case, and then because of the federal guidelines, because the co-defendants are facing years in prison, they'll cut a deal and say, yes, he told me to do this in order to, interfere with the investigation. And all of a sudden, where there was no crime and there should never have been an investigation, there's a danger of a conviction.
I mean, it's exactly what they did in the Russiagate hoax. They went after them on this expansive witch hunt and basically made up crimes. And then because these people dared to testify in good faith, found them on obstruction charges and put people in jail. And unfortunately, I think that's where this is headed. So what would be your advice to the Trump lawyers handling these cases one by one? What should they be doing? And then what's the likely outcome once they institute these methods?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is what they are doing is, to some extent, as an attorney for him, you have to set aside the election and you have to say, okay, how do we win this case? How do we get all of the facts before them? And so there should be reasonable delays and very exhaustive and extensive discovery to do this. The biggest challenge he's going to face in DC, in Fulton County, Georgia, and in Manhattan is getting a fair jury. So there's going to be a lot of effort and emphasis that's going to have to be put into pretrial litigation to do that. I would be filing multiple, motions to change the venue in those cases. I would be filing multiple pretrial motions to try to get expansive jury selection, to be able to get questionnaires to those jurors. I mean, treat it like a capital case. Do that kind of in-depth jury selection to even get a fair shot. I would look very carefully at, challenging judges, challenging the fairness of the judges that are sitting on those cases, particularly in the DC courts. But again, I think it is important within the bounds of professional ethics to try this case in the public. And so to the extent the judges don't allow them to do that, that's going to have a huge hindrance, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure people understand this. And with the Georgia case in particular, there is a scenario where this backfires on the Soros-backed DA that's bringing this case and on those that are behind this, because if truth starts to come out through the discovery process about what actually happened in the Georgia election and why Trump and his team believe there were irregularities and election fraud, then that's big news. That's going to get a lot of people asking questions. So it is an interesting thing that that's where they've tried to go after this, because I do think there's evidence of fraud in Fulton County, Georgia, that has to be looked at. And I think there was a lot of fraud in other places as well, but I think there was egregious fraud there.
So let's look at the worst case scenario. Let's say they do find him guilty and they actually put Trump in prison. Obviously, we have the appellate process, but how expedited do you expect that to be? Some of these charges hold massive amounts of prison time, literally trying to put this guy in his grave behind bars. I mean, first of all, what are your thoughts as a human being if we do find this guy guilty? And what does our country look like? And then what is the process for him after the fact to try to seek justice in the appellate court?
Well, just first, as a voter, as an American citizen, as a retired military officer, I'm terrified by the precedent that this kind of political prosecution sets. But, we missed it. In 2014, Soros and Obama went on an effort to win county DAs elections, right? They've dumped millions and millions of dollars into these local DA elections. And we hear about Soros-funded prosecutors, but I don't think many in the conservative movement really understood how dangerous that precedent was and why that was being done. Because in our legal system as a nation, we give a tremendous amount of discretion to prosecutors to bring cases. And again, process as punishment. That's the precedent we're setting here. And I fear what that looks like, because now it is targeting of political opponents. That's why this is being done. And to get to the human side of it, we're looking at a grandfather who has served his nation as president, who is nonviolent, who on January 6th was calling for people to be peaceful and to do the right things. And we're going to lock that person in a cage, like some kind of an animal, because they're that dangerous. Even at his age, it does not make sense. That kind of incarceration doesn't make sense. If we could just take his name out of it, we wouldn't be doing that. And the problem with the appeals process, as we look into that, you're talking years and years and years and millions of dollars in attorney's fees in order to fight this. And again, what's going to happen? Is he going to run for office from prison? Is it going to take Supreme Court intervention? What does that look like? We don't know, because some of this is unprecedented, but it's very dangerous.
It's extremely dangerous. And quite frankly, I don't know if that's the final nail in the coffin of this constitutional republic. If he is convicted and we do have some type of an appeals process, do you even think there's a hope of him getting out?
Again, it depends on what case we're looking at. Like the Mar-a-Lago case, for example, I think there's very weak things about that way that's being pursued when we look at that case, other than the obstruction charges. When we look at the DC case, the way it's being charged, can they actually prove that? If the evidence comes in, they couldn't. So you do have a hope that at some level, appellate court judges on the federal side would look at these cases, understand what they are, understand the unprecedented nature, and grant relief. But for DC, you're looking at the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, not exactly a Trump-friendly court. In Georgia, things might look a little different, but New York, you're not going to get much relief. The appeals court for Florida, if it went there, I think has been reasonable, has done some fair things, even if we look at COVID mandates and other things. So there is hope there. It's just going to take a lot of time, and it is dangerous for our nation to start to continue a precedent of throwing political opponents in jail over things where, at worst, he's doing something that every other president has already done, or he's trying to legally challenge election results when there's evidence of fraud, and then we're going to go after him for that. Very, very dangerous, very concerning.
Extremely dangerous. Davis, let my audience know where they can find you.
So our website is Younts Law. That's younts.law.com. It's at Davis Younts on Twitter. Most of my legal career has been spent in the military. More recently, we've been doing a lot to help people who are facing religious persecution, as well as fighting back against mandates related to the vaccine and other things. So happy to chat if these issues come up. We have to fight to preserve our Constitution, and we cannot lose focus on that. We need to find peaceful means to do this. We need to encourage Congress to defund the DOJ, and we need to pay attention to what's happening in our military moving forward. So thank you so much for the time to talk about this. Appreciate it.
Davis, an absolute pleasure to get your insight. We've got to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the possibility of the return of the COVID-19 84 nightmare and how to stay